So you work hard, you become a leader. Now, what do? There's a lot of responsibility that comes with being a leader. Just because you do your job exceptionally well does not mean that you'll be a good manager over your coworkers. Many line workers, they can't make this shift to become managers, let alone leaders, because leaders require a different set of skills. They set different goals for themselves. They take on other challenging responsibilities. The very concept of leadership has been so distorted that we grow up with the wrong reasons to become a leader. We envision that when we become leaders, we have the power to tell others what to do, power to make a lot more money, power to do things our own way. But Jesus gives us some keen insight into the nature of power when he stands trial before Pilate. If we can remember, Pilate pleads with the Jews to change their minds about crucifying Christ. He famously says, referring to Jesus and pointing to the Jewish leaders, "Behold the man, I find no fault in him." But the Jewish leaders, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." In John 19, starting at verse 7, just the context of that, it says that the Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to the law he must die," because he claimed to be the Son of God. And when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. Pilate didn't realize, he didn't know who he was dealing with. He didn't know what situation he was dealing with, and was afraid there was something supernatural going on here, possibly, and he was afraid. So he went back into the palace, verse 9, and asked, "Where do you come from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or crucify you?" And Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given you from above." Jesus had Pilate see that just because he held a high government position, he had no real power. He had no power to do what he thought was right. And despite his better judgment, it was either crucify Jesus or have a riot on his hands, followed by his superiors replacing him because he would not defend the laws of Caesar. So Pilate chose, in giving the option of saving himself or saving Jesus, the obvious answer to Pilate was he chose to save himself. He had no power. Some things are beyond your control. You can't control a recession that causes businesses to collapse. You can't control the start or end of a war, whether a military one or a trade war that depletes your financial or human capital. But what can you control? You being a leader, what can you control? You can control how you treat other people during good times and bad. You can control how you treat the people who work for you. Proverbs 28:3 says that a ruler or a leader who oppresses the poor is like a driving rain that leaves no crops. He'll leave a trail of utter destruction behind. And 28:16 says, among leaders who lack insight, abuse abounds. But for one who hates corruption, the future is bright. So chaos abounds when a leader abandons biblical principles. And one more, 29:12 says, when a leader listens to malicious gossip, all the workers get infected with evil. It's the leader who sets the tone for the company. Whether employees are known to be honest or fair-minded or being corrupt and backstabbing, it starts at the top and trickles down. Despite their narcissistic personalities, politicians can make great sacrifices. And they do, despite all the talk about politicians. They can make great sacrifices serving the people. In Taiwan and in many other governments around the world, the members of parliament, they get to fighting to show that they are so passionate about their constituents that they are willing to literally fight for the people. And we can see the videos or the photos of the members of parliament actually duking it out on the floor. But as with many professions, there are those who abuse their position. Now, some don't really care about the people. They'll run for president in order to sell their books. They'll run in hopes of using the U.S. Treasury as their personal piggy bank. And the distortion even creeps into the church. And if we will, just take a look at Matthew 20. We may have seen some of this last time, but just to give a fuller background, Matthew 20, starting at verse 17. Talking about Jesus, it says, Jesus, now well on the way up to Jerusalem, took the 12 off to the side of the road and said, listen to me carefully. We're on our way up to Jerusalem. When we get there, the Son of Man will be betrayed to the religious leaders and scholars. They will sentence him to death. They will then hand him over to the Romans for mockery and torture and crucifixion. On the third day, he will be raised up alive. That's the backdrop. Jesus preparing the 12 for his crucifixion and his resurrection. And then, verse 20, it was about that time that the mother of the Zebedee brothers, came with her 2 sons and knelt before Jesus with a request. What do you want? Jesus asked. She said, give your word that these 2 sons of mine will be awarded the highest places of honor in your kingdom, one at your right hand, one at your left hand. Jesus talking about his crucifixion, his resurrection, and 2 of those disciples get their mother to plead their case before Jesus to be leaders, to be supreme leaders. And Jesus responded, verse 22, you have no idea what you're asking. He said to James and John, are you capable of drinking the cup that I'm about to drink? And they said, sure, why not? Jesus says, come to think of it, you are going to drink my cup. And that means suffer like he's going to suffer. But as to awarding places of honor, that's not my business. My Father is taking care of that. And when the 10 others heard about this, they lost their tempers, thoroughly disgusted with the 2 brothers. So Jesus got them together to settle things down. He says, you observed how godless rulers throw their weight around, how quickly a little power goes to their head. It's not going to be that way with you. Whoever wants to be great must become a servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. This is what the Son of Man has done. He came to serve, not be served, and then give away his life in exchange for the many who are held hostage. Jesus set the example of being a servant leader, and if we just look at in more detail how he engaged in conflict resolution, it was all done with a lot of wisdom. The 2 who wanted to be leaders, they still remained on the team. The others, the disgust subsided. They were still a team again. Jesus knew how to diffuse the situation. But in the process, he proposed a total paradigm shift. But we have to ask, can Jesus' principles be put into practice in the workplace? Can we be servants in the workplace? Can we be servant leaders in the workplace? And the answer is a resounding yes. Robert Greenleaf, who wrote Servant Leadership, and this one chapter on servant leadership in business. He says, whereas the usual assumption about the firm is that it is in business to make a profit and serve its customers, and that it does things for and to employees to get them to be more productive, the new ethic of what he's proposing, and really it goes back to what Jesus was saying, the new ethic requires a growth of those who do the work is the primary aim. The primary aim of business is to have the ones who do the work grow. And the workers then see to it that the customer is served and that the ink on the bottom line is black. It is their game. So according to the principles of servant leadership, don't make decisions based on increasing your profits. Make decisions based on what's in the best interest of your people. A servant and servant leadership also means having the business address the needs of society. This is what it's like being a servant. This is what Jesus is talking about. Anyone that you're responsible for, to, over, you're a servant to them. Yes. Proverbs 25:15 says, patient persistence pierces through indifference. Gentle speak breaks down rigid defenses. In the terms of Greenleaf, and what Jesus would say is that use gentle persuasion. Use the power of persuasion. The servant leader doesn't have to exercise the power of power, but the power of persuasion. The Quakers, they abolished slavery among their denomination 100 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. Think about it. 100 years they had given up slavery. It happened one by one. John Woolman, a merchant turned preacher, going up and down the East Coast, meeting with slave owners, preaching in the Society of Friends meetings, convincing his fellow believers of the sin of slavery. And more than that, it's more than just that slavery is a sin. He was convincing them that slave ownership has a negative impact on their moral and spiritual lives. Convincing the slave owners that they are being degraded as human beings simply because they are slave owners. It was hard work, but this was a different type of leader. He was a different type of leader who accomplished much through patient persistence, gentle persuasion. Julius Rosenwald, he didn't start Sears, Roebuck and Company, a watch company, but he bought Roebuck's interest when Alva Roebuck's health started failing. Rosenwald built up the company and diversified it into dry goods. It says dry goods, consumer durables, drugs, hardware, furniture, and nearly anything else a farm household could desire. He then took the company public in 1906, and when Mr. Sears resigned a couple of years later, Rosenwald became president. He personally helped the company weather the recession, and with the success of the company, he became restless and started focusing on the social evils and ills of that day. And he writes this in 1911. He says that the horrors that are due to race prejudice come home to the Jews more forcefully than to others of the white race on account of centuries of persecution which they have suffered and still suffer. But he also saw the parallel between the plight of the Jews and the plight of African Americans. he was introduced to Booker T. Washington by his friends, Mr. Goldman and Mr. Sachs. Yes, that Goldman Sachs. And Rosenwald endowed Tuskegee Institute so Washington wouldn't have to spend time doing the fundraising, but spend more of his time guiding the institution along. Booker T. Washington encouraged Rosenwald to address the poor state of African American education in the U.S., which suffered from inadequate buildings and books. Rosenwald provided funds to build 6 small schools in rural Alabama. And they were constructed and opened in 1913 and 14, overseen by Tuskegee. Rosenwald planned the development. He developed 421 units to provide housing for African Americans who were living in overcrowded conditions in Chicago because of the racial segregation. Part of that development included 14 stores along 47th Street, 4 of which were occupied by black-owned businesses and a nursery school. He supported the Wabash Avenue YMCA, which would become, it's a historic landmark, but it served to aid blacks during the Great Migration going up to Chicago. But he did all this while serving as chairman of the board of Sears and serving on the board of Tuskegee. There's not one set of rules. According to Jesus Christ, there's not one set of rules for Christian brothers and sisters and another set of rules for businessmen and women. They're only the words of Jesus. Whoever wants to be great among you must become a servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. That is what the Son of Man has done. He came to serve, not be served, and to give away his life in exchange for the many who are held hostage. So whether we are at work, at home, or church, we want to hear the Master say, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. You've been faithful in a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord." Amen.